Let me take you back to one of the darkest chapters in human history, World War II. By the early 1940s, the Soviet Union found itself locked in a brutal struggle for survival against Nazi Germany. On the vast, frozen battlefields of Eastern Europe, millions of young men were swept into the maelstrom. Among them was an ordinary Soviet soldier, just one face in the countless waves of Red Army infantrymen sent to the front. He didn't stand out for his rank or fame. He was not a celebrated hero at the time, nor was he expecting his story to echo through history. But what happened to him in the years that followed would become one of the most remarkable tales of escape and survival the world has ever known. Imagine the hopelessness of war. A young man, separated from his comrades, battered by injury, and trapped deep behind enemy lines. The stakes couldn't be higher. In Nazi-occupied territory, defeat often meant more than just imprisonment. For Soviet soldiers especially, capture was dreaded, and escape was considered almost impossible. This soldier, whose name would later become a symbol of determination, found himself surrounded by danger at every turn. Enemy patrols sweeping the forests, harsh winter winds biting through thin coats, hunger gnawing at already frayed nerves, and the constant threat of betrayal from locals trying to survive themselves. It was against this bleak and impossible backdrop that our soldier began a journey that would push every boundary of endurance. But this is not just a tale of miles covered on foot or simply a record of suffering and exhaustion. It is a story powered by a stubborn will to live, a flame that refused to be snuffed out, even when it seemed all hope was gone. Throughout his incredible journey, which would see him travel over 300 miles through unforgiving terrain, his drive to survive was fueled by memories of home and the hope, however faint, of seeing his family again. This is the story of how one man, armed with little more than determination and cunning, managed to defy both fate and the overwhelming power of his enemies. So let's step into his worn boots and retrace the path of this extraordinary Soviet soldier. As we do, we'll uncover not only the hardships he endured, but also the inner strength that allowed him to achieve what many thought impossible. In the chaos of war, when all seemed lost, his journey stands as a shining example of what humans are capable of when driven by a simple, powerful desire to live. Let's take a moment to step back and truly understand the man whose feet would carry him through the impossible. Our story centers on a Soviet Red Army infantryman, a figure who was, in many ways, just like so many young men swept up by the colossal tides of World War II. His name was Ivan Petrov, a humble farm boy from the rolling fields of southern Russia. Born in 1918, Ivan grew up in a small village where his family worked the land, facing hardship and hunger even before the war began. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Ivan was just 23 years old. Like millions of others, he was drafted into the Red Army with little more than the clothes on his back and the fierce determination that came from defending his homeland. Oven was assigned the rank of private, a foot soldier on the very front lines of the conflict. In the Red Army, privates made up the backbone of every operation. They advanced under fire, dug trenches in the frozen earth, and carried messages through deadly territory. Ivan's official role was as a rifleman in the 137th Rifle Division, a unit that saw some of the fiercest fighting on the Eastern Front. Despite the chaos and relentless danger, he quickly gained a reputation for his reliability and grit. He wasn't a decorated officer, nor did he possess any special privileges. He was, in every sense, an ordinary soldier thrown into an extraordinary struggle. What made Ivan stand out among his comrades was a relentless endurance and a quiet sense of responsibility, both to his fellow soldiers and to the families they all longed to return to. Day after day, he shared bread, stories, and laughter with his unit, forging bonds that would become a lifeline in the darkest moments of battle. It's these small details of Ivan's daily life that help us see him not just as a name on a page, but as a real person, someone who could have been your grandfather, brother, or friend, caught in the unthinkable storm of war. As the war raged through the vast forests and frozen fields of the Soviet Union, Ivan's division was constantly on the move, pushed and pulled by the ebb and flow of brutal clashes with enemy forces. Every day brought new dangers, air raids that sent men diving into muddy craters, artillery barrages that shattered the ground beneath their feet, and the constant threat of ambush from well-trained enemy patrols. And yet, Ivan pressed on, holding the line, his resolve forged stronger with every hardship. He wasn't driven by grand ideals or dreams of glory. His motivation was simple and deeply human. The hope of seeing his family again, of surviving long enough for peace to return. By painting Ivan's portrait in these colors, we begin to understand not just his identity and rank, but the very heart of his journey. He was an ordinary infantryman, not a famous hero, but someone whose courage and perseverance in the face of impossible odds would come to define one of the most incredible escape stories in the entire war. This is the man who would soon find himself isolated, behind enemy lines, with only his wit and will to survive. This is where Ivan's unimaginable journey truly begins. It was a morning like any other on the Eastern Front, bitterly cold, thick with fog, and heavy with the sounds of distant artillery. For so many Soviet soldiers, days began this way. Hunger gnawing at their stomachs and uncertainty hanging over them like a winter cloud. Our soldier, exhausted but determined, manned his post with a quiet vigilance, instinctively suspecting every shadow. But even the sharpest instincts can falter beneath the chaos of war. On that fateful day, disaster struck in the form of a sudden enemy push. German forces, well-armed and organized, launched a surprise attack that caught the Red Army men completely off guard. Shouts rang out, bullets whistled, and before long our soldier was separated from his comrades in the confusion and deafened by explosions that shook the ground. In the heart of the chaos, a shell detonated nearby, sending shrapnel through the air. He felt a searing pain in his leg before collapsing, struggling to crawl to safety as enemy boots thundered closer. Moments later, rough hands grabbed him, wrenching away his rifle and pulling him to his feet. Blood trickled down his face and leg as he was marched under guard, barely able to walk but forced on at gunpoint. Fear surged through him, not just for his own life, but at the rumors he'd heard. Enemy soldiers spared few kindnesses for their captives. His ordeal had only just begun. The German soldiers herded him and others like him, wounded and able-bodied alike, onto trucks. They traveled for hours, sometimes days, pressed together in silence, the injuries of the men made worse by the cold and the rough journey. At last, they arrived at the sprawling prisoner of war camp, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, where the prisoners' future depended on the whims of their captors. Inside the camp, conditions were even worse than the journey suggested. The barracks, if you could call them that, were little more than drafty wooden huts with barely any heat. Straw mattresses were infested with lice. Food was scarce. Thin soup and a chunk of stale bread formed the daily ration, barely enough to keep a man alive, let alone help wounds heal. Disease spread quickly in the cramped quarters, and medical care was rudimentary, at best. The soldier watched men wither away from illness and malnutrition, their spirits eroded by hunger and constant uncertainty. What truly made imprisonment agonizing was the constant fear. Some days the guards would enter, screaming and shouting, pulling men out for hard labor or interrogations. No one ever knew if they had come back. The echoing gunshots behind the fences reminded every prisoner that death was always waiting, never far away. Hope, it seemed, was a luxury few could afford. And yet, amidst the grim routine, our soldier tried to hold on to fragments of dignity. He shared what little he had with fellow prisoners and listened for any news, however faint, of the outside world. Nights were the hardest, the cold biting deeper than before, and dreams of freedom were sometimes his only comfort. Through it all, he quietly resolved that, no matter how impossible it seemed, he wouldn't give in or let this camp become his grave. The hardships and humiliations of captivity only steeled his determination. Somehow, someday, he would find a way to escape. Let's put ourselves for a moment in the soldier's boots. Hurting, hungry, locked behind enemy fences, every day a battle against despair. But hope is stubborn. That little ember inside him started to smolder, and that's when the idea of escape took root. Now planning to break out of a heavily guarded prison camp sounds like something from a movie, but for our Soviet soldier, every detail was a potential difference between freedom and capture. Or worse, escape wasn't just about sneaking past a few guards. It meant outthinking, out-hustling, and sometimes even outweighing the enemy at every turn. His first challenge was to assess his surroundings without arousing suspicion. He watched quietly which guards were most alert during which shifts, when the routine changed, and where the shadows lingered longest across the camp's fences. Every mealtime, every forced march, every roll call, he treated them as essential research. He exchanged glances and whispers with other prisoners, forging quiet alliances, sharing ideas about weak spots in the fence, or how long the watchtowers went unsupervised. Still, trust was a luxury. Any word in the wrong ear could be fatal, so secrecy was as important as courage. Planning didn't stop at logistics. Food rations were scarce, so he began saving scraps, bread crusts, dried potato skins, anything that could be tucked away for the long trek ahead. Water was even more precious. He memorized stories from prisoners about nearby rivers and creeks, piecing together a mental map. When it came to clothing, the challenge was immense. Prison uniforms were thin and tattered, no match for days or weeks on the run. He bartered, even risked small acts of thievery to gather warm layers, a sturdy pair of boots, maybe a wool cap scavenged when no one was watching. Every physical preparation was paired with a mental one. The thought of failing, of being caught, punished, maybe executed, haunted him at night. But instead of giving in, he rehearsed his plan over and over in his mind. He visualized scaling the fence, darting through the woods, tracking the stars. Each step burned into muscle memory like a secret dance. The weather could turn bitterly cold, rain could turn roads to mud, or dogs could catch his scent. So he devised alternate routes, hiding places, and signals in case unexpected dangers forced him off course. Of course, improvisation was a skill he'd need as much as any map or tool. He scavenged for anything: wire fragments for makeshift tools, a stolen knife for protection. He paid attention to every rumor. If the guards got drunk on weekends, if there was a festival in the village nearby, or if security slackened when new prisoners arrived. Every possible distraction was an opportunity. In the end, planning the escape became a mission that gave him purpose, a lifeline in the overwhelming bleakness. Each tiny victory, smuggling a matchstick, learning the guard's patrol pattern, hiding a crust of bread, stacked up until finally the moment came. He stood ready, not just with supplies and secret knowledge, but with steely determination. The odds, the obstacles, the risks, they were all part of the plan. And when he made his move, it wasn't just desperation, but the culmination of weeks, maybe months, of quietly, bravely putting hope into action. This was not luck. This was ingenious, patient, and brave survival, the escape journey. As night covered the camp in darkness and the world seemed to hush, the soldier made his move. Every sense was stretched taut. He knew that a single mistake, a snapped twig, a nervous gasp could doom him. But with quiet determination, he slipped past the barbed wire, ducking into the waiting shadows beyond the prison walls and stepping straight into a world filled with danger at every turn. His body was battered and tired, an untreated bullet wound throbbed with every step, but the iron will to survive pushed him forward. The first challenge was distance. 300 miles of enemy territory awaited, with no map, no allies, and scarce food or water. The land itself seemed to conspire against him. Forests offered cover, but were thick with undergrowth and roots that threatened to trip him up, all while the lack of proper boots turned every mile into agony. Yet each dawn he pressed on, driven by the thought of home, the hope of freedom, and the sheer stubbornness to live. Hunger quickly became an unrelenting companion. Scouring the forest floor for anything edible, berries, roots, insects, he learned to quiet the ache in his stomach, rationing what little he could find. Water was another precious rarity, and more than once he knelt by a trickling stream, feeling immense gratitude for even a handful of muddy liquid. Sometimes he would stumble across the remains of a derelict barn or the abandoned campfire of a patrol, and he'd scavenge what he could: old bits of bread, a forgotten potato, which became lifesavers. But the land was not the only threat. Enemy patrols stalked the roads and forests, and the sound of distant barking from search dogs would shoot terror straight into his heart. There were close calls when the crunch of boots on leaves came too near, or beams of lantern light swept across his hiding place. He learned to become part of the landscape, pressing himself into ditches, burrowing under fallen logs, or lying motionless in freezing puddles for hours at a time. The fear of discovery was constant, but he never allowed it to paralyze him. Every moment demanded courage, and he found it, again and again. Weather, too, became a formidable opponent. Cold rain lashed his face as he shivered beneath soaked clothing, while biting winter winds tried to strip him of hope. Some nights he barely slept, just short, restless moments before the cold or fear woke him up again. Each dawn, though, he told himself he would not give up. The journey became almost a rhythm, walking by night, hiding and resting by day, always creeping steadily closer to freedom. He was not entirely alone on this journey. His thoughts often turned to family, to his fellow soldiers, and sometimes in rare acts of kindness, to villagers who risked their lives with a loaf of bread or a wordless gesture of sympathy. These fleeting moments of humanity bolstered his resolve, reminding him what he was fighting for and why surrender was never an option. Every step was a battle. Blisters opened, old wounds festered, and exhaustion gnawed at his strength. But his mind clung fiercely to hope. He counted the miles in his head, celebrating every creek crossed, every patrol avoided, every horizon reached. Though the world around him was hostile and unforgiving, he would not let it break him. With grit and a quiet, burning courage, he kept moving forward. 300 miles, one painful mile at a time, toward the distant promise of safety. After days, no weeks, of hardship beyond what most of us can imagine, the soldier's eyes finally glimpsed a scene that made his heart pound with hope instead of fear. The friendly outlines of Soviet positions on the horizon. Every step he had taken, every wound he'd ignored, every moment he'd kept moving forward while exhausted and starving, was for this moment. Suddenly, all the instincts that had kept him cautious and hidden seemed to give way. He staggered out from the cover of the trees, desperate for someone, anyone, to see him and know he was one of their own. As he drew closer, hands shaking and legs barely able to hold him, he called out in Russian, pouring all his battered strength into those first few words, announcing who he was and pleading for help. The sense of relief was almost overwhelming, but safety didn't wash away struggle in an instant. The soldiers who found him were at first skeptical. Who wouldn't be in wartime after a stranger appears out of nowhere behind the lines? But even before his story came spilling out, his ragged uniform, sunken cheeks, and haunted eyes told a story all their own. He was quickly brought inside the camp, given food and water, and above all, a measure of security he hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. Imagine the feeling of finally letting your guard down, just a little after months of relentless danger. Yet, the immediate relief of arrival was matched by new challenges. Hunger and thirst gave way to exhaustion and illness. Too weak to stand, the soldier collapsed, finally able to rest his head without fear. Medics rushed to tend to wounds that had, until now, only ever received makeshift bandages and wishful thinking. Each sip of soup, each gentle word from a nurse, was proof he had truly made it. He was among friends again. But survival brought its own burdens. Interrogations followed as officers tried to confirm his identity and story. Even after the truth was clear, his mind struggled to catch up. All the exhaustion, cold, anxiety, and loneliness of his escape now pressed down on him at once, forcing him to confront what he'd been through. At times he wondered, how had he managed to survive when so many had not? Word of his incredible trek began to spread through the camp, and soon his endurance was a source of inspiration to the men around him. Some looked at him in awe, others with a sense of kinship, feeling that if he could find his way out of hell, maybe there was hope for them too. And as the days passed, his body slowly regained strength. The soldier began to realize what his escape meant, not just for himself, but for every soldier hoping against hope for a second chance. His arrival in friendly territory wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where his survival stood as living proof of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable will to live. The long journey was finally over, but its meaning, both for the soldier and those who heard his tale, was just beginning to unfold. As we reach the end of this incredible journey, it's important to pause and reflect on what the soldier's escape truly represents, not just for him or even for the countless others who fought and suffered in the chaos of war, but for every one of us who faces moments of darkness and despair. When we retrace the soldier's path, beginning with unimaginable hardship, enduring physical pain, hunger, and the constant terror of being discovered, we see far more than a simple tale of survival against the odds. We see a vivid example of the relentless power of the human spirit, the kind that refuses to give up even when giving up seems like the only option left. Every step that the soldier took, dragging himself across frozen landscapes and hostile terrain, with enemy patrols always close behind, speaks to the strength of someone propelled by hope, determination, and a deep desire to live. His escape wasn't guaranteed. In fact, the obstacles were so immense, the odds so stacked against him, that most people would have given in to despair. But this journey of 300 grueling miles is not just a story about one man running from danger. It's a shining reminder that sometimes the strongest weapon we have isn't a gun or a fist. It's the sheer will to go on, to push ourselves one step further, no matter how much it hurts or how hopeless things may seem. Stories like this resonate because they reveal something universal about humanity. When faced with the impossible, people are capable of astonishing feats of endurance. The details, the cold, the exhaustion, the hunger, make this soldier's journey intensely personal, yet familiar to anyone who's ever struggled through their own challenges, big or small. Ultimately, his escape is a testament not just to survival, but to resilience. It invites us to imagine what we, too, might be capable of if pushed to the edge. And it urges us to never underestimate our own reserves of courage and determination. So as we look back on those 300 miles, let's remember that the real victory here isn't just reaching safety. It's the triumph of spirit, the refusal to accept defeat, and the unwavering belief that there is light, even in the darkest moments. In the larger context of history, in the shadow of war's devastation, stories like this remind us all that as long as hope survives, so do we. And maybe, just maybe, we each carry within us the strength to take those next impossible steps, no matter what hardships lie ahead.